Welcome to our CyberWise Chats, where we talk about the challenges of raising and teaching digital kids. I'm Diana Graber, author of Raising Humans in a Digital World and founder of CyberWise and CyberCivics. Join every episode with Dr. Pamela Rutledge, who's the director of the Media Psychology Research Center. Our always lively conversations tackle topics like cyberbullying, screen time, TikTok, and everything in between. We've got some great guests and promise each chat will give you the tips, tricks, and confidence you need to help kids use technology safely and wisely. All right, welcome everybody. So happy to have you here. We had a little technical stuff happening in the background, but we're good to go. Welcome to our CyberWise chat. Whether you're here joining us live on the webinar or you're going to listen to this on the podcast, we're really happy to have you. As you know, today we're talking about shared and compared, our kids online and their privacy, etc. We got lots to talk about. I'm Diana Graber, author of Raising Humans in a Digital World and founder of CyberWise and CyberCivics, here with Dr. Pamela Rutledge, who is the director of the Media Psychology Research Center. And we are so honored today to welcome Deborah Heitner. She is the author of a really good book. I just finished it, Growing Up in Public, Coming of Age in a Digital World. And if you read it and you're a parent and you have a kid anywhere between 2 and 30, I really encourage you to read it. It's, you know, what I really loved about it is Deborah's tone. I mean, she's so empathetic and respectful of kids. And I'll tell you, in this business, that's rare. People like, scary, it's horrible out there. And you're not going to get this from this book. And I really loved her stories. And I really loved her questions that she gets from parents. I was chuckling because same old questions, right? Yeah. So Pam just wrote a really lovely blog post about the book that you can find on the CyberWise website. But if you don't have time to read it, Pam, maybe you can tell us what you wrote and what your thoughts of the book were.
Well, Deborah, first of all, it's so lovely to have you here, and I agree with Diana that the tone of your book is really engaging because there's so many stories that it helps people put themselves into it. But I think the thing that I most appreciated was the emphasis on mentoring versus monitoring, where you're actually preparing kids to live in this world rather than trying to keep them safe. And I also really liked the part where you're saying, well, what are the implications if you're doing this monitoring? What are the implications of this psychologically? What are you doing to motivation? What are you doing to trust? What are you doing to the relationship? And I thought that's something that doesn't get emphasized enough. We just stop the discussion whether track or not track, and we don't talk about the longer term implications on media and digital literacy. So those are my favorite parts. But mostly welcome. It's lovely to have you here.
Thank you so much. I've been following your work, both of you, for a long time, and it's fun to be in conversation because I think there are a lot of really scary messages out there about what kids are doing. And I appreciate that we're all on the same page about having empathy for kids and families and not just using scare tactics about technology that we all frankly need to live our lives and do our work at this point.
And Pam and I have talked about that a lot, that we're really kindred spirits in this realm, and there's not a lot of us, so really happy. But I wanted to start with really a general question, because I think a lot of parents don't even stop to think about how much their kids are surveilled today. I mean, we hear a lot of parental control software, but could you set the stage for us a little bit? You wrote about this so beautifully in your book, but just all the ways kids are tracked today.
Yeah, so kids are tracked. Literally, my kid is tracked on a QR code when he checks into classes at his large suburban high school in Illinois. So literally his location is being tracked. Many parents are also adding either Find My Phone or Life 360 or another location geo-tracker. Kids are then tracking one another on things like Snapchat Maps, seeing where each other are visiting colleges. So there's just like a lot of kind of NSA style tracking that way. Parents sometimes are mirroring their kids' phones so that they can read their texts, see where they go online. And a lot of that tracking, well, we can get into the implications of it, but that's just a lot. Then grade tracking is another thing that's happening, where parents can see into their kids' grades every single day, even hour on hour, like quizzes and assignments coming in. And, you know, I don't need to get a ping on my phone when on the first day of school, my kid's doing the hello, how are you chat with a neighbor in Spanish class and they're like 5 out of 5, your kid introduced themselves to someone in Spanish. Like, I don't need to see that. That's too much information.
I mean, can you imagine? Like, I don't need to say it because I think every adult listening to this will say, "God, could you imagine what would have happened if I was a kid and my parents knew everything I was doing every second in school? Like, I would be, a restriction 5 out of 7 days of the week."
It definitely lowers the trust between parents and kids, and it doesn't give kids a chance to try things and fail. Frankly, like, what happens if I don't go to X or Y, right? Like, at some point you want your kid to have that experience and see how it goes and navigate the consequences themselves. So if you're always getting in front of that as a parent, it's too much information, but it also really undermines parent teen and parent tween relationships because it turns parents into these nagging machines. And I see it in myself. Like, I have limited use of these apps, but the school leans so heavily into trying to get us to use them. And then when I do use them, it almost always leads to, a disagreement or a fight or more nagging than is healthy in the relationship. And I have to recognize, like, even if my kid does miss something, experiencing missing that, our friend Jess Leahy would say the gift of failure, right? Like, we need our kids to have that experience. They don't need us to be their, executive function full time and be their secretaries full time.
And
Yeah,
Pam,
I think that's, oh, go ahead. I was just going to say that it, as you say, it elevates every mark in these sort of grade report things into something important rather than the quizzes that are how effective is the information, or the sort of ups and downs of all of that, so that it's each one, it becomes this bigger grade. It has to be very stressful for kids.
It is. It's too much information. Kids are checking their GPA too often. My kid was quoting his GPA to the decimal point. I don't think I ever knew my GPA to the decimal point. And I think, or things like class rank in some schools, and it's just not healthy, and it takes away the focus on learning in school. There's already, I mean, I'm not even a fan of grades, so I'm like all the way over here with like intrinsic. But even if you're a fan of grades, but you want to like use a rubric or something, when you go to that numerical focus, it really takes kids out of themselves and puts them in this kind of, it puts their relationship with their teacher into a very transactional place. It's just not healthy for learning, even if you believe that grades are a great indicator of learning, which, again, I'm not necessarily personally a believer, but even if you believe that, having that feedback in a way, like if you're sitting in AP history getting your grade from calculus, that's distracting. That's too much, right? Even if you think that AP calculus grade is a useful piece of information, it's better to get that when you're in calculus or when you're home and can think about it, but not when you're at a party on a Saturday night or in another class. It's distracting.
And I want to zone in a little bit on, I know you probably get asked this a million times, as do we, but parental control software. I almost start hating that term because I hear it too much and I don't know. But I love that you talk about monitoring in fear. And I think a lot of parents feel like they have to monitor their kids on social and everything else. And maybe you can talk a minute about your feelings about that.
Sure. I mean, I've been a fan since my last book, Screenwise, and even before that, of mentoring over monitoring, which is, as I know you all are as well, of really being in conversation with our kids, understanding their lived experience. What, if you want to use Snapchat, if you want to use Discord, what are you using this app for? What role is it going to play in your life? What are the ways you're going to stay safe if something on the app, violates one of your boundaries, or if someone more likely on the app violates, like the app themselves aren't doing anything, but like if someone, does something that bothers you, what are your available responses? And that kind of mentoring, frankly, feels like a lot of work, where sticking an app on your kid's phone that tracks what they do can feel like less work. But in the end, the information you get from that app is going to be very limited. That app doesn't know you or your child. Your kid could be upstairs, crying in their room because of something someone said to them that the app would never pick up. So I think the problem with these monitoring apps is it gives parents a false sense that they know what's going on, and that it can drive up anxiety and mistrust, but it doesn't actually tell you what's going on. Having the close relationship with your kid, having them be able to come to you if a situation is truly threatening or difficult or harming their mental health, that's the ideal situation. You want your child to have you or another trusted adult that they can talk to. And developmentally, it may not always be you, but as long as like, hey, they can really talk to their school counselor, or they can really talk to my sibling, their aunt or uncle, like there may be someone else at some point in your child's life and in the course of your relationship, and it might not be you. But as long as they have a safe adult to talk to, that's always better than just getting all that information. Because you also, as a parent, are not really equipped. Like I know for me, I would be reliving middle school traumas and high school traumas if I was just reading all the texts.
And plus,
Right.
it teaches your child nothing.
It teaches your child nothing, and you're not actually understanding what's going on because you're not in those relationships.
They have to learn the skills to like manage themselves on these things.
And right, exactly. To know, like, if they mess up, for example, the friends may pull them back in and say, "Hey, that's not okay. That joke wasn't funny," and they need to have those experiences with their peers.
Yeah, it's like
Well, all of that software is very binary. It's like put it on, don't put it on. It doesn't have any differentiation between the developmental age of the child, the maturity of the child, how to start, how to let, when you need it, when you don't. It's very much spyware. And,
Right.
one of the things that you talked about that I thought was very important is parents who feel compelled to spy and their kids don't know. And then what do they do with this information? Because at the point when you feel like you need to intervene, you just expose yourself as a spy.
Right, you've painted yourself into a corner. So that's why I would say if you are doing some monitoring, and I will say as the age goes down and down and down of a first phone, and it is a powerful communication device. And when I see kids are getting a watch in second grade, for example, and when I say mentoring over monitoring, I'm not saying get your second grader a watch, get your fourth grader a smartphone, and then like come back in 3 years and see how it went. That's not mentoring, right? We would never put our kids in the pool without some swimming lessons. I think it's so important that we are guiding that access when you should be maybe taking that device at night. Maybe they have limited access to it. Maybe they can't just get whatever apps they want or feel like. So I'm not suggesting that mentoring over monitoring means we don't ever look with them, for example, even at their device. And especially when we're talking about elementary schoolers getting devices, it may make sense to sit down and look at it with them. But that's a kind of a collaborative mentoring. And yes, there's a monitoring aspect of it, but you're doing it with your kid. And you're also having a plan, as Pam brought up, for backing off. Like you're like, okay, if I see you're in the fifth grade group text and we're looking at it together sometimes and I see that it's going well, maybe then I'll say I don't need to look at it. I still might say you can only do it for a little while after school. I don't want you doing it instead of sleeping or homework, right? I don't want it taking over your life. But I want you to come to me if these kinds of things happen and really go through with kids. What are some scenarios where you would expect them to bring that to you or another adult? Because they do need to know, hey, these are some red letter situations. And again, especially in elementary school where so many kids are now getting access that young, I certainly don't think we want to just be pure trial and error on everything. I do think, middle school and high school is a little bit different. So the level of privacy kids need as adolescents is different. I don't think a 9-year-old needs as much personal privacy as a 13 or a 15-year-old just developmentally. I still think they should be able to have their own chats with their friends. But if they're, say, on Roblox in the living room and you overhear something and your kid's in fourth grade, like by all means, you can like give them some feedback, I believe, and just say, hey, like, how did that go? Like, I heard your friends and you were all kind of calling each other losers and everyone was upset at the end. Like, what could go differently next time? Whereas like maybe in 10th grade, you would just sort of like sit back and like see how it went down. I think in the elementary school years, and especially with all that our kids have missed, like my kid didn't go to sixth grade, right? Because of the pandemic, like there's things that kids may have missed. So I do think we can intervene. I really like the sort of casual intervention of like, I'm just overhearing this and how's it going, as opposed to the covert spying. And then again, as kids get older, they may need more privacy. By the time your kid is dating, for example, you should not be reading those texts. That is not for your eyes.
And plus, the key is with those older kids, they're going to go under. They know they're being
They
spied.
will absolutely go underground. And so that's where I think parents who really lean into waiting on social media, I think there's some price for that. Now, I am again not saying every kid in the single digits or at age 11, should have a zillion social apps. But I do think if your kid has reached 13, 14, and they don't have access to any social apps and they really want access to at least one social app, I would rather lean into mentoring them on one app, letting them learn to use it in a safe way, in a guided way, as opposed to risking that they go underground and create an account or two or three that you don't know about. That would be more concerning. And so that's the tricky thing. And I know we may have different feelings about what age that should be, but it really is partly dependent, honestly, on the peer group. And not that we as parents want to just do what other parents have decided, but truly, if all of your kids' friends are DMing on Instagram or if they're all on Discord, you are setting your kid up to want to go around you if they cannot communicate with those friends at all to make plans or to play games. And so I would say we want to lean into maybe allowing some access, but maybe it's not in the bedroom, maybe it's not, on a device they carry around with them. It's something to really think about. And I think it's also important to look at your own child's strengths and challenges where they are developmentally and socially, and kind of think about what are some of the pitfalls of this app for this kid right now? What are some of the advantages of being connected? And really look at your own child and not just look at, oh, I saw a scary headline once about Roblox, so I'm going to say never Roblox ever. You know, I think we have to kind of be in the complexity. Every single one of these apps, you can have a yucky experience. 100%. Pinterest, you can have a yucky experience. You can see porn on Pinterest. Like, there is no app, including Facebook Messenger for kids, including YouTube for kids, that I'm going to say is 100% guaranteed good experience.
Right. So true.
Well, and or the middle school hall. I mean, I think parents forget that that this is just a continuum of the drama that happens as kids grow up, and they're saying mean things to each other or not. That's happening at school. So it's by suppressing social media, you're not saving your kid from social drama.
100%.
Exactly.
100%.
Exactly. Okay, so in looking at the time, I do want to talk about a really important topic that you address in your book so beautifully, and it's parenting, and that's something that comes up a lot for those of you who don't know what it is. So many parents, relatives, etc., are so excited to share pictures and posts about their kids from the time they're very, very young. What do you kind of set the stage here? What are your feelings about that?
I mean, I have a lot of empathy for the isolation parents have been through, and especially in these last few years, but just in general, being a parent can be isolating. I understand why people want to share. And, I'm exactly, I would say, in the generation of parents who, Facebook came out when my kid was a baby. Of course, I wanted to share him. We did share him as a baby and toddler a little bit there. And then as I started to think about the privacy implications, as I started to talk to more people, as I watched people make their kids into influencers on YouTube, I became more cautious and recognize that kids should have more autonomy about their digital footprint, about what's shared about them, and that it's an incredible opportunity. If we ask our kids before we share about them, we're giving them the opportunity to think about consent, to think about their public presence. We're having a really important conversation as a family. And very importantly, we're making them feel safe at home and in their relationship with us. They don't feel like they have to avoid us, that we're paparazzi, that we're going to embarrass them. Many things parents innocuously share about their children are embarrassing to kids, either at the time or later. They can become fuel for those classmates who might not be the nicest at all times. And we don't want to give, other kids information about our kid that we don't think about in that way, right? But like say your kid is home snuggling with their stuffed animals in 4th grade or 5th grade, and that's great. I mean, I like a good stuffed animal cuddle too, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But in 4th grade, that might really interfere with your kids' 4th grade street cred. So maybe that's not the image they want out there. And they should be safe at home to be who they are and snuggle with whomever. And I think that's what's so important, is if we share that, we're violating that sanctity of home where they feel safe being their sweet inner selves. And we don't want to be doing that, because they might actually start to repress themselves. And as parents, it's the last thing we want, right? Is our kids to stop doing something like singing to themselves or snuggling with stuffed animals.
I'm so glad that you addressed that in your book, because I tell you, that's something that hurts my heart, because when I'm with 6th graders and we're doing our unit on digital reputation and cyber civics, inevitably what comes up is the kids are like, oh, my mom posted this and this is on this thing, and will you talk to my mom and tell her not to do this? I'm like, that's your job.
I've had kids invent apps for that. I'll do app design workshops and they'll invent apps to stop their parents from sharing things.
Wow. Well, it's
asking you to do it because you have social power as an adult. I think it's really hard for kids to ask their parents that.
Just came up with I should send it to you and get your thoughts on it, but it's a consent agreement that we came up with for social media that families can share between each other and their relatives. And I think that might help a child to have this little agreement that that's actually, they don't have to think of the words, but they can present this and have a conversation about it. So,
well, and not only that, but these conversations that you're having, Deborah, are helping kids understand the magnitude of public. In other words, it's very difficult to conceptualize what it means to be public as it is on the internet. So as you're sort of working them through the sort of levels of consent and explaining boundaries, they start to get a much a broader view of what it means to actually share things on TikTok or YouTube or those places, which is a really difficult concept, even for many adults. And and you have to grow. The other thing I think parents forget is that they are essentially defining their kids' identity by posting these pictures. And I've had parents say, well, I'm so worried because my lovely child, that's not what his profile looks like, where they're worried about this disconnect between as you say, the street cred and the snuggle bear. And we all have different identities. That is a function of social engagement, right? I am different professionally than I am with my family, or I am at a football game versus, with, friends getting my nails done, or, whatever all these situations are. And so the idea that you can't have different aspects of your identity, that parents worry about that, I think is something that they need to think about in the sort of more subjective way that we experience it, the sort of pre-media identity complexity.
We have to give our
So-
kids their full humanity. Exactly. Like we are different on, like, I'm different on Instagram versus LinkedIn. And I think kids need that space to be themselves at home versus at school. And we all had a school self and a home self as well. Even if you're really like at a lovely little school and you feel very safe, it's still a different world than your family and your parents and siblings and pets. So I think that's very, very important. And I think we also, it's tempting to use our kids as content because they're so cute. And I think it's just so important to recognize that as much as we get all this love, there's other ways to also share about our kids. And when we need support about our kids, when our kids are struggling, that's also a place to maybe not go to social media because it's so public. And to think about other ways to connect with parents, whether it's a parenting group, calling your best friend, reaching out to a therapist. Like we do need support. I'm not saying suffer alone if your kid or you are going through a hard time. I just think we need to think about is this a safe way to do it? Would my kid want me to put their school anxiety or their bedwetting or their social challenges out there in public? And I think the answer is heck no, they would not.
And that kind of goes to everything that I really liked about the book, is that you are so respectful of kid culture. And, part of that is that they do have their own culture and they have their own sense of humor and their own language online that we will never understand. I mean, think about when we were young, we had the same thing with our peers. It just wasn't on an online platform. And I think the fact that you respect that and remind parents that they're not going to understand everything that they see in a game, or in a text chat is really, really powerful. So I really liked your comments on that.
Okay, so one of my burning questions, Deborah, is you start your book by saying, when you get a call from a principal, it usually means something bad has happened. What do you say to them when something bad has happened?
Well, first of all, I mean, I'm glad they reached out. Obviously, there's not that much we can do immediately. I mean, there are many things we can do to make the situation better, but once something has happened, it's not like we need to immediately sort of, like, people often want to go into like, well, then we should ban this app or something like that. And that's usually not a strong solution. It's more like, how can we over the next few months and years build a culture where ideally students will be more supportive of one another if there's something, and those kinds of things. So I do think it's really crucial to have those conversations and kind of think about building the culture and not just be in a reactive responsive mode, and especially not be in such a punitive mode with kids who mess up, but more in a learning mode and kind of noticing, like, if a kid messes up, say they share something really horrific or problematic that's harmful to the community. And I'm not saying that kid is, consequence free, no big deal, they're just a kid. If we do harm, we have to deal with the consequences and make repairs. But ideally, we're also addressing the harm in the community. And sometimes we get so focused on the perpetrator and we forget that there may be 5 or 10 other kids that did the same thing and just didn't get caught, that we're not thinking about, wait, how did this kind of percolate in our community? What can we do in a bigger way to support kids? And if there was a community that was targeted or an individual that was targeted, how can we support those people or that group or that individual? So there's just a holistic conversation that needs to happen when things like that happen in a school community, which happens a lot.
So you're just talking them off the ledge and trying to get them away from the lizard brain and into the rational side where they're doing some forward planning and have some empathy for the situation. I think that's brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You had A great question too, Pam. I'm kind of going through our notes because we've zipped past a lot of really good questions, but we deal so much with fear. Like, how do you get parents past the fear to the point where they can start understanding the benefits of what kids are doing online?
That is such a great question. I mean, I'm really excited about learning about what young people are doing. Having your kids show you maybe some of the games or apps or channels that they really love and what they're learning from those. When I ask a group of kids, what have you learned from YouTube? And again, like, YouTube is a lot to deal with as a parent. TikTok is a lot to deal with. There's a lot of content we don't love out there. But when I ask kids what they've learned, they're like, repair drywall, make homemade pasta, make pie, like they're learning stuff. And that's incredible. And so we also want to honor what are the positives that they're getting, what are they learning, and how can we give space for them to apply that learning? Like if you see your kid leaning into cooking shows, by all means, have them make dinner, have them make cupcakes. Like you should be eating the fruits of their labor and not just like watching YouTube with them, right? So we want to take some of the things they're learning and also translate that into a skill that's going to make them a very popular roommate one day.
Yeah, I wonder how much of the conversation parents have with kids about technology is very negative. I mean, it makes me think of sort of basic parenting 101, which is reward what goes well. In other words, I love that you watch cooking videos, or rather than why are you on your device, but you're really noting, audibly noting the positives that they're experiencing, whether or not that doesn't change the relationship between the child and the parent.
Yeah, and I think
Well, and giving kids an opportunity to have real life explorations, or if you want kids to do more unplugged things, even just noticing their online interests can help you. If you have a kid who's really into a World War II online game, would they like to play Risk or another board game with you or other friends? I mean, so I do think a little bit of our job as maybe analog experts is to like help our kids find some cool analog things that they may not have heard of, because they have been, especially since the pandemic, I think, so immersed in getting so much of their new experiences and kind of novelty from the online world. But just taking that cue of like, oh, my kid's really into making slime. Would they, want to do some other cool chemistry things, right? Like just kind of using that as information as opposed to a power struggle about just why are you on your device?
yeah, and one thing I kept thinking about reading your book is it's sometimes I think it's hard for parents to be good mentors because sometimes I think kids are doing things better than we are online, which really brings me to the point that I always tell parents is like, learn from your kids. Like your example of kids learning new skills or new hobbies via TikTok or YouTube. I mean, that's a great thing for us to realize, like, these are good sources. If you've never learned how to knit and that's something you want to do, like go to YouTube, look it up. So I think sometimes there's areas they can mentor us in that we should listen and have that be a collaborative conversation. I think that opens doors to have that conversation flowing both ways.
Mm-hmm.
I wish that we had time to get deeply into this, but I do want to take a couple seconds to talk about your chapter on sexting because you had such a refreshing, open viewpoint towards it that it's more natural or normal than we want to admit to ourselves. So if you could just a few moments kind of
Yeah, I had really good conversations with adults and kids about this. It's a tricky topic. I think none of us are super comfortable with the sort of privacy and social risks, let alone the legal risks. I know someone will bring up of sexting, but it's important to not lean into fear tactics so that our kids can talk to us. They need to understand that if someone does sort of threaten them or try to coerce them, that's a problem that they can talk with us, or if they willingly and non-coercively share an image and then someone uses it later in a coercive or threatening way or shares beyond the consented audience, that's still a problem. It's not okay. And just being in conversation with our kids as we teach them about sexuality, as we talk to them about dating, about falling in love, about romance, just making sure that we talk with them about sharing images, whether it's something that comes up for them or their friends, and that we talk with them more about safety and respect and not from a shame-based perspective. That we always want to be talking about, safety, integrity, responsibility, and consent, and not just scary, scary, shame, shame, or you'll go to jail if you do that. Because they all know kids who've shared images that haven't gone to jail. Thankfully, I don't think I want to live in a world where, 15-year-olds are going to jail for consensually sharing images with other kids, right? Like that's not a good situation. And when that does happen, I think that's a real misuse of the law. And so we really just need to keep our kids safe in all these ways. And again, they are safest if they have an adult they can talk to, especially if they're in a jam or are having some second thoughts. And we have to recognize as our kids get older that this may be part of some relationships that our kids may be part of. And like, if you see it by mistake, try to like block it from your own hard drive. Like that was not for you. And that is frankly, a risk that I think about. Like it's, one of the many reasons that like maybe, we think twice before we do it as adults is like we've all sent a text to the wrong person. And this is the kind of text where sending it to the wrong person would feel very embarrassing. So just, worth thinking about, but not trying to scare our kids so much that they can't talk to us, especially if they're in a situation where maybe they've already shared images in the context of a relationship.
Yeah, and I love that you give, tips what to do should this happen, here's your steps. So just be prepared that this might be a part of the teenage life online.
And I know you've talked with Samir Hinduja before, right? And so like the safer sexting tips came from an article that he wrote with his writing partner.
Justin.
Oh my goodness. Thank you, Justin Patchen. And like that was really brave of them to put that out there, because I think as adults, anything that seems like it's even condoning anything sexual with kids just feels like we're not allowed to say it. And yet we live in a society where a lot of people are delaying marriage until their 30s. I mean, is this people like, is that the idea? Like, I don't know what people think, but
yeah, what's really tough for kids.
You're talking to a kid who's 11 and going through puberty, and you think they're going to delay any sexual experience until they're 30. I think it's worth, just asking yourself how realistic.
What really confuses kids is we teach visual literacy, and then I teach them sexting right after that. And so they have seen, and they see this all the time. There are so many sexually explicit images all over the internet,
and on billboards that you drive by on the highway. I mean,
were they to send that between each other, it's like you throw the book at them. So that's such a disconnect in their brains, like for them to understand why or how is huge. And real quick, before we leave this topic, I just wanted to put out there for those of you who don't know what we're talking about, the Cyberbullying Research Center is such a great resource on cyberbullying and also sexting. And they did put out some great information on safe sexting that if you do have teenagers, I really encourage you to check out their site.
Yeah, I interviewed them for Growing Up in Public. I'm so glad that I got to talk with them again about this topic. And I also really appreciate Elizabeth Englander's research. There's a lot of great scholarship that is in that chapter, and partly because you really do need this sort of anonymous studies to go into some of kids' experience. And I just want to mention quickly that I also talked a little bit about the differences between queer kids and trans kids and just kids in the LGBTQ plus spectrum versus maybe cis and straight identified kids on this topic. And that's worth leaning into. Whether or not you know how your kid identifies at this point, just worth kind of understanding some of the differences and some of the different pressures on different kids depending on their identity in this space.
That was really a good part of what I really enjoyed about the book too, is that you looked at all different kinds of kids, and I think that's really important. Before we go into our takeaways, I did have a question because I was curious myself. You wrote a previous book that was also excellent, Screenwise. Between writing Screenwise and this book, what has changed the most for you out there with kids and technology?
I mean, the pandemic was a huge accelerant to a lot of trends that were already going on. And I do have a new edition of Screenwise as well. That's like sort of the post-pandemic Screenwise. And I would say if you're a parent listening to this, like Screenwise is the younger book. Like it's more about received screen time and what, thinking about understanding that in a qualitative way. And Growing Up in Public is more about what kids are putting out there about themselves, what we're putting out there about them, more of the interactive social media book. I mean, there's some overlap, but in terms of the ages, you could read either one. But, if I had like a 6-year-old, I might read Screenwise first. If you have a 9 or 10 and up, I might go right to Growing Up in Public. Anyway, I think the pandemic is a huge difference. I think at this point, ed tech is almost universal. I know maybe at a few schools that's not the case, but I think in almost all schools it's universal. Whereas when I first wrote Screenwise, it was like some schools might have, your kid with a Chromebook. Like now that's pretty universal. So it's worth thinking about making sure kids are getting some of those skills at home. And finally, I think the first generation of kids to grow up with some social media, or at least the early days of like online networking of various kinds, are coming of age and now raising their own kids. And so that's been really interesting to see, like, your MySpace kids are now having kids.
Yeah. It's so funny. MySpace always makes me laugh because when I do this lesson where I ask kids like, let's talk about old media and new media. And when I think of old media, I think of newspapers and radio, and kids think of MySpace.
Or Facebook.
Now, yeah, Facebook. That's old.
Originally, growing up in public, my publisher wanted to make the book Facebook Blue, and I was like,
Yeah.
don't do it.
They'll be like, no, no. Anyway, so gosh,
One
we
app
could,
that no kids are using.
yeah, we could actually talk for another hour, but we try to keep these things short so it's really easy for parents to listen to. But I know, Pam, we always end with our takeaways. Like there's so many for today, but what
There,
are your top takeaways from our conversation?
well, I think the one that we keep emphasizing that I think is critically important is talk early, talk often. That you really want to build a relationship because, as Deborah, as you so beautifully described, you really want kids to be able to come to you when they have questions or when they have problems. And that really, if you're doing that, you in fact are mentoring and you don't need to monitor if you're having that conversation. So that was sort of two takeaways in one.
I love that.
Yeah. And then did you have takeaways for your own? Like when you finish the book, like what would you like parents to take away from it?
I really want parents to take away that kids are changing the norms around disclosure and what we share about ourselves. And as much as it can be uncomfortable for us to see kids sharing about their mental health, neurodiversity, survivorship, identity, gender and sexuality identities, they are changing the culture by doing this, and they're on the kind of leading edge. And I totally empathize with parents who are nervous about this. I interviewed one parent for the book who said, I get reducing stigma, but does it have to be my kid on the front lines? And I hear that, but I just want us to understand that our kids are coming of age with a whole generation that is doing this and sharing about themselves. So when we say they'll never get a job if they come out in high school, well, they will, because the world will be different. And maybe their manager also came out in high school or has 6 friends who came out in high school, right? It's like a different world.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say it's a better one in that way, right? Like, I don't think the world is universally getting better. There's some challenges that our kids have every right to be like asking us, like, how did we let this happen? But that's one thing that the kids are doing that I think is really leading a positive social change. And if we can support them and understand that and let our own anxiety about stigmas, kind of reduce a little bit in witnessing that. And, I think that can make the world a better place.
That is so beautifully said. I sort of don't even want to give my takeaways because that I would like to end on, but I will just underscore what you said that I love so much is that they are changing the culture in ways that we can't even imagine, to give them grace as they do that and try to be understanding that they are living in a really different world, and maybe remember that there's really positive things happen online. It's not all scary and horrible. So try to lean into the positive and help them develop the skills they need to make more of the positive happen. So your book does that in a very beautiful way. So thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it. If you missed today, we will put it out there on the podcast, also on the webinar. And our next talk is in about a month. We are going to be talking about preparing neurodivergent children for a digital world. Deborah, you probably are well aware of that topic. It's so important today. That's
is that Meryl Alper? Or...
We're actually talking to Sony Albright, who's on our
Oh,
staff, who's getting some special training in this area, has a neurodivergent child of her own that she's helping through a digital world. So we're really excited to tackle that topic next time.
That's going to be really cool. I do recommend Meryl's book as well if you have a chance to read it.
It's so really, really good. Yes.
And if I can just say, there's a free discussion guide to my book on my website at deborahheitner.com, because I do think for any book, including your books, including other books out there on this topic, if you can talk with other parents, I just think it's a great way to dive into these conversations, whether it's through your school or your local library. So I would say,
what? I'm glad
talk more about growing up in public. Come check out my website.
Don't you think it helps? Don't you think it helps the kids so much when the parents are on the same page? It's like it makes their world 100 times easier, because you don't have 10 kids on Snapchat and 10 kids not on Snapchat. Whatever it is that they agree on. And
you can reduce your kind of anxiety. I think other parents are a huge help. In this realm.
Exactly. And so I just do want to end with, can you please tell parents where to find your book?
So you can get the book in all the places you can order books online, as well as at your local independent bookstore, as well as at your local public library. And if your independent bookstore or public library doesn't have it yet, you can let them know and they can get it really easily because it's Penguin Random House. So And come to my website to get the free discussion guide at devorahheitner.com. And then I'm also on Substack, where I do a newsletter, and that's free. And I'm on Instagram, LinkedIn, all the places with these lovely people where we chat about all the things.
Great.
So,
Great. Well, we'll put that out there when we do the follow-up
you.
to this. And again, thank you so much for being with us today. It's such a pleasure to chat with you. Your work, as usual, is awesome. And
Likewise, it's such a really honor to be with you all, and thank you for all the work that you do. And
likewise to you.
take care. Have a
Keep
great
at it.
day,
Get well.
everyone.
Get well.
Yeah, get well.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. See you next time. Hey, parents. If you enjoyed today's podcast and want to learn more, please visit our website just for you at www.cyberwise.org. But more importantly, if your kids are not already receiving digital literacy lessons in school, then you're definitely going to want to visit our other website, www.cybercivics.com, to learn more about our in-school curriculum called CyberCivics. And please tell your children's schools about it, because every student deserves to be prepared to thrive in a digital world.